just want to start by welcoming everybody to Marxism Festival 2021 online. My name is Emma Davis. I'm a member of the Socialist Workers Party in Newham, and also I'm a rep for the National Education Union. And our meeting this afternoon is Anti-Capitalist Environmentalism, Why Bill Gates Won't Save the World. We have three fantastic speakers who will speak for 12 minutes each, and I'm going to introduce them one at a time. We will then have time for discussion and questions, and then each speaker will have 5 minutes to come back at the end. I would also like to make people aware that the chat function is turned off for security reasons. However, if anyone has a question, they can message me directly. And if it is a question which they would like to have put to the panel, they can message it to me and I might be able to read it out. So without further ado, I'll move on to introducing our first speaker. Our first speaker is Ashley Dawson. Ashley is Professor of Post-Colonial Studies in the English Department at the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and the College of Staten Island. His latest books include People's Power, Reclaiming the Energy Commons, Extreme Cities, The Peril and Promise of Urban Life in the Age of Climate Change, and Extinction, A Radical History. He's also a member of the Social Text Collective and the founder of the CUNY Climate Action Lab. He's a longtime climate justice activist, and he's currently at work on a book entitled Environmentalism from Below. So I'm really excited, and a warm welcome to Ashley Dawson. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma, for your introduction. It's so good to be with you all today. The topic for today is why Bill Gates can't save the world. I'll give you a short answer, a little bit longer answer, and then the longest answer. The short answer is, to quote the Black feminist Audre Lorde, that the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. A little bit longer version of the answer is that we need system change, and the elites who have constructed, who benefit from, and who maintain a system grounded in massive inequality, injustice, and ecocide are unable and unwilling to take the steps necessary to dismantle the fundamental driver of environmental breakdown, which is a capitalist system grounded in ceaseless exponential growth on a finite planet. Now, the longer answer, or the longest answer, I'm not going to go into Bill Gates's recent book in too much detail because I believe one of the other panelists is going to go through that book. What I'm going to do is pick just one particular area to explore, an area which I think exemplifies the problems and the contradictions that I've underlined with my shorter answers. Okay, so let me launch straight into it. I'm going to focus on agriculture. You might think, agriculture? Why agriculture? Isn't Bill Gates into technology? Well, it's important to know that 14 years ago, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation launched the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. The acronym is AGRA. That was in 2006. And the goal of this initiative, which was done in collaboration with the Rockefeller Foundation here in the US, was to double productivity and incomes by 2020 of 30 million small-scale farming households in Africa, and to reduce food insecurity in about 20 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, Gates and Rockefeller spent about $1 billion to impose all of the kinds of inputs that characterize the corporatized industrial capitalist agriculture model that dominates in Europe and in the United States in sub-Saharan Africa, where the vast majority of people are subsistence farmers. So what are the components of this form of capitalist agriculture? They include commercialized seeds, petrochemical fertilizers and pesticides derived from fossil fuels, and many other elements of kind of high-tech agriculture. And in order to do that, the Gates and Rockefeller foundations persuaded African governments to support these plans. So many governments in sub-Saharan Africa that are dealing with tremendous and unjust debt burdens spent huge sums on subsidies to farmers so that they could buy all of the expensive inputs that characterize the Green Revolution. And what this led to was a shift away from subsistence crops that are highly nutritious and traditional in many sub-Saharan African countries like sorghum and sweet potatoes. And these are key staples that offer a great deal of nutrition for farmers, to cash crops like corn. So you had a replacement of crops that were key to subsistence for crops that were intended for export and for selling on markets. Sacrificing crop diversity also sacrificed families' diet diversity and made the kind of resulting monocultural forms of agriculture quite fragile, so that when drought hit corn crops, for instance, farmers who had given up diversity for monoculturing didn't have any kinds of drought-resistant crops to fall back on. In addition, monocrop farming that the Green Revolution is characterized by, and that the Gates Foundation supported, degrades the soil over the long term. So putting in all of those pesticides and fertilizers turns the soil more acidic and eventually leaches away a lot of the fertile topsoil. So, 2 decades later, the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa and the Gates Foundation claim that they've been highly successful. But last year, a broad-based civil society alliance published a report called False Promises, in which they concluded that the number of Africans suffering extreme hunger has increased by 30% in the 13 countries that AGRA eventually focused on. Well, let's take a step back. Why a green revolution in Africa? AGRA, of course, claims that it's because sub-Saharan Africa is dogged by persistent poverty, and that very much falls in line with the kinds of representations that one sees in the Western media of African countries. But a more important reason is that the Green Revolution was rolled out in Asia predominantly, starting in the 1960s. The kind of ground zero was the Punjab in India, and that the Green Revolution there has depleted the soils to dangerous levels and left farmers unable to survive. And the last couple of months have seen massive protests outside New Delhi in India by farmers who are unable to survive, even with government subsidies. And the protests were targeting the Indian government's, the BJP's effort to cut back subsidies to farmers and throw them onto the free market. So what was the context for the Green Revolution? It had to do with the effort by countries that were fighting against imperialism, fighting for freedom from colonization, to ramp up their agricultural sectors to support agriculture. And they did that through land redistribution, essentially taking land away from the wealthy landlords who had controlled it during the colonial era and had functioned as a kind of intermediary stratum for the colonizers, and giving it back to the people who actually farmed the land, right? So if you look at revolutionary movements in the post-1945 period, from China to Cuba to Burkina Faso, revolutionary campaigns for land redistribution were sweeping across the world. The Green Revolution was a response on the part of policy elites in the US and on the part of foundations to roll back these land redistribution efforts. And it's important to remember that the foundation that the Gates folks participated with or partnered with in AGRA is the Rockefeller Foundation. Rockefeller was absolutely key to the Green Revolution, along with the Ford Foundation. So Rockefeller, of course, is based in oil, right? It comes out of the Standard Oil fortune, and Ford Foundation comes out of automobiles. So it's no coincidence that the Green Revolution is grounded in fossil fuel-based pesticides, fertilizers, and big machinery like tractors, right? It was an opportunity to sell all of these inputs to the global south to establish new markets. But in the course of doing all of that and getting farmers and governments to buy into these kinds of initiatives, what ended up happening was that only the more wealthy farmers could afford to buy hybrid seeds, fossil fuel inputs, large-scale machinery. So there's a kind of enclosure, a whole series of enclosures which continue the trend which Marx talked about in terms of primitive accumulation, right? There's an enclosure of the seeds, which became patented, so you had to buy your seeds rather than being able to trade them and replant them for free as part of a seed commons. But there was also an enclosure of land. So, you know, the wealthier farmers bought up land and displaced small peasants. And as Mike Davis talks about in his important book, Planet of Slums, what resulted was a global dispossession of a really significant segment of the peasantry who were pushed into off their land into growing megacities around the world. And of course, in my book, like Extreme Cities, I've talked about the resulting extreme vulnerabilities as those populations who are now dependent on the free market for access to food are faced with climate crisis. So it's a toxic situation that's developed as a result of the Green Revolution. The idea of spreading it into Africa is a horrendous kind of technological solution. What's the alternative? Well, it's important to note that there's been a consistent fight back, not just in the anti-colonial period that I talked about already, but in recent decades where transnational peasant alliances like La Via Campesina have pushed back against the kind of technological capitalist solutions to agricultural transformation and have advanced platforms based on two kind of key concepts and practices: agroecology and food sovereignty. What is agroecology? It's a science of sustainable agroecosystems, and it's also a kind of social movement that includes recycling nutrients and energy on farms rather than using external chemical inputs, integrated pest and nutrition management, conservation tillage, so rather than disrupting the soil and turning it over, you kind of keep it in place, water harvesting and livestock integration. And so all of this we could think of as a kind of real cutting edge version of multi-species science and practice and even ethics, one that aligns with traditional indigenous and small-scale farming practices, but also draws on the latest science to kind of develop a relatively symbiotic relationship between people, plants, and organisms in the soil. So it's a cutting edge scientific and social practice, and it's intimately tied to food sovereignty, the other kind of key plank that I mentioned in relation to La Via Campesina. La Via Campesina defines food sovereignty as the right of farmers and peasants to produce food and the right of consumers to be able to decide what they consume and how and by whom it is produced. Okay, so being able to fight off the kind of commodification and capitalist market-based agriculture that the Gates Foundation has been pushing into sub-Saharan Africa and supporting around the world. Thank you so much, Emma. Being able to fight off those kinds of capitalist incursions, those kinds of new enclosures, those kinds of land grabs is absolutely key to La Via Campesina's project. It's key to the ability of peasants to remain on the land, and it's key to also absorbing significant amounts of carbon, right? Because maintaining good agricultural practices like agroecology means keeping the soil healthy, means absorbing carbon rather than depleting the soil and turning the soil into a carbon emitter. So it's also a kind of key climate justice strategy, one that, again, the Gates Foundation is helping to erode. Okay, thank you so much for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ashley. And I'm sure if the 241 people who are currently listening could all be giving you a big round of applause, they would be, and they probably are from their living rooms. But thank you for that fascinating contribution. All right, we'll now move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Gyekye Tanoh. He's an anti-capitalist, eco-socialist campaigner, a socialist, a member of the International Socialist Organization in Ghana, which is the SWP's sister organization. He's a developmental economist, currently working with Hand and Brain African Activists Collective. Thank you so much for joining us, Gyekye.
Thank you very much, Emma, and thanks to the Socialist Workers Party for organizing this very important get-together, so to speak. Thanks to Ashley as well for a very illuminating introduction into the topic. I thought Ashley's starting point was really excellent for the kind of emphasis that I want to bring to this discussion. First and foremost, we all know that the climate change, the emission of CO2 gases, and so on, is actually a problem that originates or is rooted in the global north in terms of the developed economies, in terms of their long-standing, breakneck type of economic growth, profit-seeking growth based on fossil energies, and so on and so forth. However, we also know that it is these processes and the actors that perpetrate them, for example, the transnational companies and so on, are very much present in Africa as well, as indeed is the question of global capitalism itself. It is impossible to understand the global south and to understand continents like Africa in their evolution over the past 500 years without understanding the ways in which they've been integrated in a variety of different adverse ways into the emergence of the evolution from global markets, such as the market in human labor, slavery, into a global economy where the production and livelihood of different laboring populations, working populations in one part of the world has to be in consonance with, is constrained by, or enhanced by its interrelationship and the role it occupies, the place it occupies within a global system. So globalization, capitalism, imperialism, climate change, in a sense, for the purposes of this discussion, I think are terms that support each other, and in a sense, they evoke meanings that are mutually reinforcing and interchangeable. So when we talk in terms of anti-capitalism and anti-capitalist and environmentalism, we also ought to talk in terms of the symmetries that can confront some of these things. And as I said, we can't understand places like the global south, which is what I want to concentrate on, and in Africa, about Africa in particular, places like the global south, without understanding the ways in which these rhythms play out in the region. If you looked at the international media headlines in the past week, I think two or three particular headlines will stand out. First is what is happening in Mozambique. Mozambique is the site of a multi-billion, 15 billion pound investment in liquid natural gas by Total, the French multinational company, supported by the Mozambican government, and in a very remote part of Mozambique, which for generations has been marginalized in terms of the collapse of agricultural systems, and that the kinds of subsistence, independent or autonomous subsistence existence that Ashley referred to has collapsed as a result of lack of investment, increasing commodification of land, and of course the devastating whirlwinds of the impacts of global trade liberalization and neoliberalism writ large. But in the past few years, that area has become, they've suddenly discovered gemstones and liquid natural gas, and it is beginning to attract huge amounts of foreign investment, the presence of huge multinational companies, the presence of privatized armies, if you think about it in a certain sense, and of course, any resistance by the local population in terms of their displacement has been met by a brutal militarized response from the Mozambican state itself. In those circumstances, different kinds of resistance has emerged, including one that has been sparked by a so-called Islamist group, which contends with what is happening, is trying to seize control of important assets, is also trying to challenge what is happening in terms of the lack of redistribution and so on. So in a sense, it is an expression of the kind of discontent that has been generated in Cabo Delgado, this province in Mozambique, for a long time. 6 weeks ago, this insurgency came closest to the Italian installations, the liquid natural gas installations. The expatriate company, the transnational company, of course, withdrew all its personnel. It declared what had happened as an act of God, which obviously means that the very little obligations it has to the Mozambican economy will be suspended, if not abrogated, all of us in its entirety. And the local population, who have been driven from one side to another, one by the displacement of this liquid natural gas thing, by the collapse of the agrarian systems and so on, are trapped in the new settlement that they have. And 40,000 people have managed to escape by foot, but the Mozambican army traps them in that place. Now, what is happening there is a nightmarish experience. but it's a nightmarish experience which does not explain itself simply by focusing on the locality of where this is happening. Already the players are global. We just said so. Okay, so it makes no sense to constrain or confine our understanding or our discussion to that particular locality. Mozambique is also a country that has been buffeted by violent, erratic weather events, such as the cyclone Idai that took place a couple of years ago, and also recently, earlier this year, different such events took place there. Cyclone Idai, for example, hit the second biggest city in Mozambique, Beira, which is also its port city as well. This is a city which has grown exponentially, the population, precisely because of rhythms of a rural collapse, the deindustrialization that privatization has brought and globalization has brought, and the privatization of the port system itself and so on. So you find in countries like Africa, in countries like the Global South, where there is, if you like, a more widespread and more direct reliance on natural resources in terms of livelihoods and so on, you find that the impacts of the environment, not only are they more immediate in terms of in a real existential way, but that the extremity with which they intersect and integrate with other features of neoliberal capitalism and the global system in general are particularly pronounced. And therefore, when you hear characters like Bill Gates posing as philanthropists who are interested in the poor and so on and so forth, and you hear about some of their schemes, for example, the AGRA, the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, which actually explained so excellently well. Okay, and you think about some of the other tropes of the whole Gates mission. It really tells us the importance of the need to intensify our resistance to those people. The other headline that you would have read about Bill Gates in the past week will be his lobbying of on behalf of big pharma, that vaccines, anti-COVID vaccines should not, the patents should not be
remaining.
Sure, okay. Should not be liberated for different people to produce. If you go to an establishment like the European Union, the organizations that have been lobbying the European Union hard, if you look at the visitors book, somebody published a list of their visitors in the past few days, Bill Gates and the organizations associated with the Gates Foundations have been one of the most regular visitors to the European Commission and its decision makers and so on and so forth. So they know how to organize. They know how to organize in terms of their alliances with governments and intergovernmental institutions. They know how to organize in terms of their alliance with multinational companies, of which Bill Gates himself, of course, is at the head of one. But they also know how to mobilize in terms of seeking market openings, which extend the exploitative system and profit-making of capitalism itself. One of the reasons why Gates promotes the kind of technologies that Ashley was talking about, or is opposed to the liberalization of the vaccine regime, is precisely because he believes that through public subsidies, you can and through an attractive price, you can deliver a system of global anti-poverty, which entices profit-making institutions and are subsidized by the state to deliver cheap goods for ordinary people. That is the philosophy. And for people like Gates, as long as somebody buys something, as long as there's an apparent market for something, there is evidence that thing serves an important social need, and that it is the best way, in the best of all possible worlds, to provide that need. So the technologies that he talks about, the kinds of things that he talks about, the same way. That is why, in terms of their approach to cheapening price and the reliance on market mechanisms, they have no compunction in cheapening lives as well. People like Bill Gates are those who crusade about overpopulation in regions like Africa. They talk in terms of the fact that, yes, there is, there may be fossil fuel people who are not regulated and therefore they go into excess, but look at the ways in which Africa itself is hugely overpopulated. Look at what its own population does in terms of its own self. Yes, it is true. If you go to any African country, especially in the urban areas, environmental pollution is a big killer. My own home city, where I'm talking from now, Accra, the World Health Organization has demonstrated in the past couple of years that tens of thousands of people die every year as a result of what it calls urban pollution. From the reliance of poor households on wood fuels for their cooking, from uncollected solid waste, from pollution in terms of e-waste that is dumped in the country from foreign multinationals and so on and so forth. We know that the mining regime that pollutes the environment continues. We know that the fossil fuel industries are powerful in this region, extraordinarily powerful, and are able to actually make super profits from sale of products which will not be allowed anywhere else in terms of the pollutants and toxins that are in it. But the reason why people like Gates still go on about the fact that these are consequences of individual behaviors, these are consequences of unenlightened populations, these are reasons why we have to bring back population control and family planning in some of those pernicious ways, including the promotion of contraception for women, which is likely to aggravate blood clotting far more than any COVID vaccine can do for a lot of people anywhere, and so on and so forth. So when we look in these terms, I have to summarize, I know I'm running out of time. When we look at this cheapening of the idea of population, it is not about how do the populations exist. It is not about what are the conditions of their livelihood, their rates of consumption. What it is simply about, there is a group of people out there that in the clash of civilizations, in the careening towards disaster, there is a group of people out there whose uncontrolled behaviors, they happen to be darker people from the poorer parts of the world, their uncontrolled behaviors, the threat of their migration, all of these things add up to ensure that to have a sustainable world, you ought to cut back on some of these populations and so on. I don't have time to enter into this particular argument, but I think it's a particularly important argument in relation to the Global South generally, but in relation to Africa specifically, and for reasons that I think are of strategic interest to every single eco-socialist, every single anti-capitalist, every single socialist. The reason is this. Yes, if you look at the broad trajectory and trends in the African population growth, it is the highest in the world. Right? It is true. It is the youngest population in the world. It is the fastest urbanizing population in the world. By the year 2050, only 30 years or so, from more than 50% of the total growth of the global working class will be African. By the end of the century, 82% of the total global working class will be African. Now, if you are like Gates, and for you, it is a matter of curbing and controlling and ensuring that there's a barrier of $1.90 a day as the upper limit, the lower limit of poverty. Sorry, okay. If you are like Gates, then what you are doing is that populations who, through their own struggles, have managed to win a modicum of education, a modicum of skills, and so on and so forth, in a period where global value chains, global production networks are extending, that you are ensuring that massive additions to the global working class come from the most deprived, the most underpaid, the most exploited, the most oppressive populations in the world. And that these populations, because many of them are moving with rapidity to the urban centers and so on, are also divided very often. For those of you who might have listened to the first session on is Marxism Eurocentric, are divided in terms of where they're coming from, their ethnic origin, their religion, and so on and so forth. And that a defense of community and so on, without interrogating more critically and more expansively, more comprehensively, the relations that exist within those communities themselves, the question of gender, of youth, and so on, and allies that with the fact that these are different sections of people who increasingly are reliant on the production of surplus value for somebody else, for their own livelihood. And that the radical restructuring of property relations through the boom in mining, boom in agriculture, like Ashley was talking about, and so on, also renders increasing pressures on people to look for wage work, and that there is a community of interest as a result between farming communities, working class communities of whatever race, whatever ethnic group, whatever religious background, and that the central issue for anti-capitalist environmentalism, especially in areas like the Global South, is to seek ways in which the constant uprising, the localized mutinies against the encroachment of transnational companies, against the depredations of the state, against all kinds of abuses, that becomes integrated into a movement which is a class-based movement, which is a movement that does not stop at single localized solutions, but can build the widest unity because it is globally opposed to the global system. In other words, the anti-capitalist environmentalism must birth not only a new internationalism, it must also birth a new working class politics based on a new integrated agenda uniting people that includes socialist politics alongside anti-capitalist environmentalism. I'll stop here. Sorry for running out of time.
Thank you so much, Gyekye, and I'm really sorry for having to ask you to sum up because I could have continued listening to you speaking for much longer, and I'm sure others feel the same. That was absolutely brilliant. All right, our next and final speaker from the platform is Amy Leather. Amy is author of a new pamphlet, Capitalism and the Politics of Food. She's also a contributor to the book, System Change, Not Climate Change, A Revolutionary Response to Environmental Crisis. and she is Joint National Secretary of the Socialist Workers Party. Thank you, Amy.
Well, thanks, Emma, and thanks so much to Ashley and Gyekye. Fantastic to speak on the panel with you both. And so when we talk about Bill Gates, he really seems to be everywhere this year, doesn't he? Putting forward his solutions to the problem of climate change. His book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, was brought out to great fanfare, favourably reviewed in The Guardian, serialised on Radio 4. And Gates himself, a keynote speaker at Biden's virtual climate summit just at the end of last month, a key staging post towards the COP26 climate talks in November. So we might want to ask, what does he bring to the table? He's the world's richest man, but essentially he's made his billions by getting lucky when IBM adopted his Microsoft operating system and put it on their computers as it rolled out. Why does this make him an expert on climate change? I actually think it tells you something about the nature of capitalism. Those with money get access to the decision makers to put forward their solutions. And here, perhaps it's no surprise that Gates's solutions benefit him and also the class he represents. But as such, they're quite worth engaging with, because his book and ideas represent a capitalist ruling class intervention into the debates about climate change and what can be done. It offers an insight into how they see it. And in many ways, they've been forced to make such a response because of the fantastic movements that have put climate change firmly on the agenda. Remember pre-COVID in 2019, when the eruption of protests led by school students demanding action all across the globe. And in a lot of those movements, there was increasing generalisation. The popular slogan, system change, not climate change, really pointing to the systemic nature of the problem, looking at capitalism, an inherently anti-ecological system run for profit based on competition and exploitation, with many people concluding that the way to solve climate change is to dismantle the system. You see, in contrast, Gates is putting a counter-argument to that radicalism. His argument is that capitalism can be part of the solution. And his starting point here is that climate change represents, and these are his words, a huge economic opportunity. He goes on to say, the countries that build great zero carbon companies and industries will be the ones to lead the global economy in the coming decades. Well, I have to say, to reduce climate change to an economic opportunity means you have no concept of the devastating consequences that are already happening and impacting on millions of people. And both our previous speakers made that really clear. You know, barely any mention in his book of droughts or flooding, particularly in the global south, rising sea levels, the issue of climate refugees, wider ecological environmental problems like the rate of extinction, biodiversity crisis, plastic pollution, and no sense at all about how colonialism and imperialism have driven the processes that have led to environmental degradation. The solution Gates offers is technology and innovation. Essentially, he sees climate change as a technological problem to be solved, rather than a social, political and economic issue. Now, just to be clear, socialists are not against technology per se, but we do understand technology is not a neutral force, separate from the rest of society. There are always questions of who controls it, who funds it, how it's used, who has access to it, who benefits, and crucially, who's making money from it. And the key thing when we talk about technology is actually we already have the technology to solve climate change and have done for some time in the form of renewable energy, combined with massive increases in energy efficiency. Wind, solar and tidal power have the potential to produce enough power and energy for us all. And actually, there was a report out in 2015 in the run-up to the COP talks in Paris that year by Mark Jacobson and Mark DeLucci. They went through how each of 139 countries could generate all their energy for homes, business, industry, transport, agriculture, everything from wind, solar and water power by 2050. Now, they were talking on a massive scale, 2 billion rooftop solar systems, 4 million wind turbines. And these ideas have been developed since 2015. But Gates is very disparaging about renewables. He puts a strong argument they're not enough. He says solar power is not efficient. Wind turbines and solar panels will take up too much room. We can't use them, he says. Actually, recent figures shows that wind power could power the world something like 15 times over using offshore turbines. And that a massive, I think it's like 20% of the land area globally is desert. So you could use a small chunk of the Sahara desert for solar panels, for example. But Gates is not interested in exploring this potential and doesn't argue for more investment or development in the renewable sector. In fact, in the past, he said government subsidies should be directed away from wind and solar and go to something new. And this is what his emphasis is on: new technological solutions, many of which are unproven or a long way from development, or actually may cause further environmental consequences. So, for example, he's quite a fan of geoengineering, which aims to deliberately manipulate the world's environmental processes. So you'd use technology to make changes to the environment, to the oceans, to the clouds, using different chemicals to help stop climate change. Now, these are direct interventions into ecological systems. They would have great unknown consequences and dangers. Another idea he discusses is carbon capture. The idea carbon can be sucked out of the atmosphere. Now, again, the technology doesn't actually fully exist. There's one plant so far. To do it, though, it uses an enormous amount of water and energy and massive costs, estimates at £24 trillion a year. A lot more than renewables would cost. Gates is also very taken with the possibilities of electric cars. There's a lot of emphasis in his book on this and the development of batteries that could store more power. Just worth noting, batteries like that would be quite reliant on chemicals and lithium. But perhaps it's not a surprise, because as becomes very clear throughout his book, these are the areas in which he owns companies or has already invested in. For example, he owns Breakthrough Energy, a company that invests in startups that are developing new battery technology and biofuels. And while dismissing wind and solar, there's one type of energy that Gates really puts his weight behind, and that's nuclear energy. He even argues at one point that ships powered by nuclear power may be possible. Now, again, this may not be a surprise, because it just so happens Gates is the founder of nuclear innovation company TerraPower. And don't worry, Gates assures those of us who might be a bit worried about the use of nuclear power, given the potential for disasters like that of Fukushima in 2011, he argues nuclear power is carbon-free and can be made safe through innovation. Now, it's just not true. It ignores the impact of mining of uranium. It's not a carbon-free process and offers no solution to the question of highly dangerous radioactive waste and the enormous amounts of energy needed to store and move it safely. And actually, the disaster of Fukushima shows exactly what happens when nuclear power companies cut corners to maximise their profits. But you can begin to see how these solutions that Gates is pushing are ones that are likely to make him and people like him more money. But he also argues for governments to help with this process by underwriting the risk for private business. He argues the government's role is to come in and put that investment in if private companies think it's too risky and not sure they'll make a profit. And once it's clear they will make a profit, hand all that over to private companies. So this essentially does amount to an argument for solutions to climate change that help make capitalists rich. But it's also an approach by saying that if we do all this, we don't need to do anything else. Corporate capitalism can then just continue business as usual, doing what it's always done. And I think this brings us to the crux of the issue, because there is a very simple solution to climate change: to leave coal and oil and gas in the ground and make a rapid switch to renewables. Now, that would require massive government intervention, actually, not to help big business make more profit, but to inject the money needed to completely transform our energy base and economy. But here, we're up against entrenched interests. The whole infrastructure of capitalism has been built on fossil fuels, first coal and then oil. And we live in a world today of vast sunken investments in the fossil fuel industries, which would all have to be written off if we were going to transition to renewables. Such a global write-off of capital would be unprecedented. It's actually the rational thing to do to prevent climate catastrophe. It's irrational from the point of view of the capitalist driven forward by profit and already having made that investment. And we're in a situation where there are very powerful vested interests at the heart of these industries that resist any such change. Naomi Klein wrote in 2013 that in the US alone, oil and gas industries were spending some $400,000 a day lobbying Congress and government officials. So perhaps then it's not a surprise that these fossil fuel companies received subsidies of $400 billion in 2018 alone. Since the Paris climate talks of 2015, banks across the world have provided $4 trillion of financing for fossil fuel companies. So this means the problem keeps getting worse. We may have had world leaders, with Bill Gates as well, meeting at the end of last month, promising these new targets, very ambitious targets to limit carbon emissions. But meanwhile, actually it's business as usual for the fossil economy. Investment in more coal-fired plants, continued expansion of fracking, tar sands exploitation, A lot of the cash injections during the COVID crisis actually in the US, Britain and Europe going to coal and oil and gas companies. We have to challenge these vested interests if we're going to be serious about stopping climate change. That isn't something that Gates would ever talk about or contemplate. It also means actually challenging the logic of capitalism with competition for profit at its heart. And you see the limits of the system actually even being exposed by Gates inadvertently, because despite his disparagement of renewables, he actually highlights Germany, where a lot of investment has gone into renewable energy, increasing their solar capacity. And what it means is in the summer, there are times when Germany's solar and wind plants generate so much electricity, the country can't use it all. So then they transmit it to neighbouring Poland and Czech Republic. But the leaders there in those countries have complained that it strains their own power grids and causes unpredictable swings in the cost of electricity. What they really mean is it undermined the prices that the electric companies in those countries could charge and undermined their profits. So to finish really, one of the aims of this book, I would say, and of Bill Gates, is to deflect the blame for climate change away from the big corporations and instead present them as being the solution. I think we have to be clear, the solutions being offered will do absolutely nothing to stop the systematic destruction of the environment that is inherent in capitalist society. Capitalism drives environmental crisis and the solutions will make it worse. And fossil fuels are embedded in every aspect of the system. And that's why I think the conclusion's got to be, we need to talk about getting rid of that system. We need to talk about revolutionary change and the complete transformation of society. And that is actually a much bigger vision than being offered by Gates. But it's also a vision that we have of how change can be made by collective action, where actually so-called ordinary people have agency, rather than just waiting for the so-called expertise of the rich and powerful, whose only interest is to make money off us. We are part of that solution of transforming the world. As Gyekye really powerfully said, whether people are peasants in Mexico, farmers in India, energy workers in France, food production workers in America, we can have an understanding of that potential collective power to challenge those vested interests at the top when we take action, go on strike, hitting the profits of those vast multinationals. And therefore, this is about actually fighting for change in the here and now, not just waiting for technological solutions to save us. It's about fighting to stop the expansion of the fossil fuel economy, for government intervention and massive investment in renewables, and fighting for green jobs, but also fighting for the end of capitalism and making real the slogan, system change, not climate change, ends.